Hello friends, how's it going? It's Michael Parker and we are back. It is 2025 and it has started off strangely. I had high hopes for this year and so far it has not been as positive as I would have wished for. Clearly this past week we had massive fires here in Los Angeles. It's been a really heavy period. For those of you who reached out to me, my family, my home is saved and I am grateful for that. I did have an interview scheduled for last Wednesday. I was not able to do it because I didn't have any power. So we lost power approximately 2:30 in the afternoon on Tuesday. We regained power and internet in the early mornings of Friday. And I'll be honest, ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the most profoundly sad things that I've ever seen. I will be doing some shows on this subject in the coming weeks. I've already reached out to some people. I will reserve my comments on what I think may or may not be behind it for right now because it's all unfolding. But just wanted you to know that's what's been going on. I traveled in December to see my family in Texas, as I always do. And then I came back here super fired up to get going, and we had this situation. So hopefully we will be able to reschedule last week's guest, James Fox, the documentary filmmaker, for another time in the near future. So let's move on. Today's guest is Matthew Ehret, a buddy, a friend that I have not seen in a few years. This will be, I think, my third or fourth time to interview Matt. He's a journalist, a cartoonist, a director of the Rising Tide Foundation, a founder of the Canadian Patriot Review, and a senior fellow of the American University in Moscow. His focus in his writings is historical analysis, geopolitics, cultural warfare. His latest work is a trilogy entitled Revenge of the Mystery Cults. Today we're going to focus on volume 1 of that trilogy, which is Mystery Babylon and the Age of Aquarius. How's it going, Matt? Welcome on.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
Happy New Year, brother.
Happy New Year. Yeah, and happy Russian New Year, too.
So I've been reading the book, and as I told you before, I'm probably about 80% of the way through the book. Your work is quite detailed. There's a lot of information in it. And when people hear the term mystery cults, I think that if they don't know what it is, to them it might connote something that is ancient, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. How would you define what a mystery cult is?
Yeah, that's a great opening question. I think that from my analysis, when I think of the term mystery cults, especially as I write about it in this trilogy, is any secret order, an order that typically has an exoteric and an esoteric parallel doctrine, one for an inner elite of initiates. Usually the initiated have to be introduced through some form of gnosis, through degrees of initiation to some point of deification of the individual, sort of some self-identification of the individual that sheds as an outcome, right? Just as the outcome, from what I can gather, is that at the highest echelon, the promise is that all of those artifacts that were keeping you withheld from your ability to actualize your God, the God that you are, conscience, cultural traditions, other things you were born into, have to be shed, with this logic that you will then be enlightened and can then control as a high priest the shadows on the cave wall, which represent, in the language I'm using right now, Plato's allegory on the cave, expressing the idea that society could be understood as through the allegory of individuals whose whole lives have been shackled, looking only at shadows and sounds on a cave wall, and the puppet masters would be those higher initiates who would be sanctioned to then control what the sense perception, which Plato considers to be what we receive as shadows, tells our mind reality is. And then he gives the example, of course, of the individual who breaks free and ends up outside the cave and has to adjust the eyes to real light, with the challenge, in the case of the Republic, of becoming a true philosopher, which means taking the risk to go back into the cave to help others free themselves so that they all exit the cave, even if it means your life is going to be put at risk, because people don't like being told that they're living in a shadowland, right, with puppet masters and sorcerers. So that's what I would say when I think of mystery cult, is that thing that has been transgenerational, maintaining an unbroken continuity since ancient times, but that has expression in our current deep state structures controlling what we call the deep state, that vets people who will be sanctioned to be in positions of influence within operations which matter, whether it's Chatham House, the CIA, the Knights of Malta, the Jesuits, whatever. There's different expressions or institutions nominally, but they all have sort of a similar sanctioning process to vet those who will be controllers of power, like the Mustafa Mons, types of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
When I was in college, I was in a fraternity, and I didn't know a lot about these types of things. I just knew that one of my best friends was in this fraternity, and I'm new in this college, and so I wanted to be part of a social situation. And one of the most important things that I took away from this was the idea, albeit some people will say it's quite benign in some ways, a fraternity, but that was my perhaps first and only taste of an actual secret society, which had heraldry, which we were required to learn. And then there was initiatory process. And one of the things you talk about in some of these cults is the idea of, dying and then being reborn as whatever it is. And that seems to me to be one of the most common elements that I hear about in rituals of these types, which is, you die and then you're reborn as whatever it is, like a skull and bones type situation.
Yeah, I think that is a common theme that I've noticed that takes place somewhere along. I mean, Skull and Bones is the most prolific of those Frickin-based secret societies that were catered to groom young talent from universities to go on to higher things. So those who would be from elite families, who would be tapped on the shoulder, would have the chance to be inducted. And yeah, you're right. Like, there's a certain idea of a crypt going down into a situation where you are going to be given a set of experiences that will replicate a feeling of death. Maybe that in some cases, some of these things involve actual life, like risking of the life, because to convince somebody that they have nearly died or did die and returned might sometimes require risking their life. So, there's a lot of cases where you have, like in Scientology at the higher degrees, you hear stories of many younger people who are going through the higher degrees who don't come out of the 7th degree. They're put through experiences, and maybe they don't, when they pass out and they wake up in the dark box underwater, they don't know how to get out of the box. That seems to be things that do happen as a consequence. Or, when you meet the Guardian at the threshold, you have your little Luke Skywalker experience with the dark version of yourself, the shadow that you have to fight. Sometimes they shy away. And for whatever reason, when you meet the Guardian, that's also a theme, trying to invoke some characteristic inside of you that is your shadow darkness, and groom it, like feed it to the point that it has a character, and then integrate with it. That's sort of the Jungian self-actualization idea. Or when you listen to what some of these deeper Jungians had gone through with the full experience, the full invisible college, there's an integration of the self with the evil, or the sacred with the profane. And if you do it successfully, and you see it promoted in some of the movies like Annihilation with Natalie Portman, they've got this promoted as well in some of our pop culture, where she has to sort of face this demonic alien version of herself that she has to integrate into. And if she fails, like her husband did, then he dies, and
yes.
The alien thing. So I think that they're sort of creating diluted forms of that for our zeitgeist, but that is a reflection of something that has been practiced by Aleister Crowley, by initiates that can be seen going back to ancient times, as just part of the deconstruction reconstruction process, because they have to sort of to build something, to maintain something. I think is so artificially unnatural as oligarchical systems are. They're very unnatural systems as far as like an offense to natural law and common decency. You have to build practices that have a quality of sacredness that will induce people to break from their conscience and all of these naturally God-given qualities that make us human. We got to cleanse that and break it at an early age as possible. So they have these things that do that. And I think, in the frat schools, a lot of the fraternities that the U.S. has in abundance. It's weird compared to other nations how many like Greek letter frats have been set up in the United States for men and for boys and girls. It's outstandingly big. It's crazy. And I think part of it is just to prepare people who may find themselves in the private or public sector into approaching being in a position of some responsibility. They have to be conditioned to that type of higher initiatory behavior, and they start in university. And, you know, maybe 1 out of 1,000 might actually be, who goes through that might actually find themselves, you know, as an executive in a strategically important military firm or something, but they will already be habituated to it and thus be more controllable. Not 100%, but more inclined to be a controlled asset to the higher machinery, I think.
I agree with you. When I look back at that experience, and I've told people this many times, when I look back at that, the most valuable thing that happened to me as a result of that, besides making some very close friends, was the understanding of this type of a group and understanding initiatory rites and rituals and this bonding that you create within a group of people. So that has been fascinating to me, and it has informed me when we talk about a lot of this stuff that people will say is within the conspiratorial context. This helps me understand how people can be tightly bound when it doesn't seem like the reason for them being bound together makes sense on the initial impression. I'm going to move on. Two of the mystery cults that you talk about in particular are Mithraism and Cybele-Attis, and talk about what both of those are, how they're similar and how they're different.
Yeah, sure. And I would add a third one too, which would be the cult of Isis.
Yes.
Or in Rome's case, the Isis Serapis, which is sort of the Roman variation of the earlier Egyptian Isis cult. And all three were sort of, I think, very much overlapping in many ways, though they were in some ways not really rivals. They were complementary to each other. Mithra was a cult brought in through Anatolia. It was a cult that was brought into Rome. I think officially it was with Pompey, right as Rome was sliding into becoming an empire. It sort of was officially brought in at that point. I think it was under Claudius, it was Caligula who fully sanctioned it, but it was operational with Pompey. And that was a male-only initiatory sect that was primarily catered to the Praetorian Guard and the upper level, actually upper and lower level legionnaires. It was pretty wide open, and you could be rich or poor or anybody, but you really, all of the higher level initiates were members of the Praetorian Guard and vice versa. So that was male only though. And it had about 7, I think archaeologists have discovered 7 known degrees of initiation. It does seem that they practiced only in underground Mithraeum. So they practiced their rites in little, not catacombs, but I guess little underground. Their temples were carved in little coves underground, usually featuring an image of Mithra, sort of a solar deity, a sol invictus, who's killing a bull sacrificially, and usually looking over his shoulder to Helios, the solar god, and away from the other god that's often presented like 70% of the time of the lunar goddess. So again, showcasing the light darkness Manichaean sort of quality that you see pervasive amongst a lot of these cults. There's different theories for what the bull represents, which we can go into later if you want. But part of I think it's Mircea Eliade who made a pretty good case that part of the aspect of the Mithraeum underground is that it reflects the womb of the earth. So again, it has an Earth Mother Gaia orientation, but again, male only as far as who's allowed to be in it. It usually, and I noticed this while I was doing some of the digging for chapter 4, I believe, for my book. There's a statistically high preponderance of temples to Cybele-Attis above or right next to existent Mithraeum that are known. They've discovered about 500 at this point that have been excavated. There's probably several thousand in the ancient world and many more still to be found, stretching all the way to North Africa, the Middle East. They're all over the Middle East and Jerusalem, big time Europe, all the way into Northern Europe. So it's a very widely spread cult. And again, so you had these temples of Cybele-Attis. Cybele was another deity, an Earth Mother Gaia figure who was brought in once again during the Second Punic War into Rome from Anatolia. It was, I think, before that in Persia. These things take on different variations or characteristics to accommodate the culture that they're going to be introduced to every single step. So when it was brought into Rome, it had certain renovations to it, but it was brought in as part of the fulfillment of a prophecy that was read by the Committee of 15 during the endpoint of the Second Punic War against Hannibal, against the Carthaginian general. And part of the idea was Rome was getting its ass kicked a little bit too much, and the Committee of 15, which was the augurs sanctioned to read the Cybele oracles. Cybele being a differently spelled word. It sounds like Cybele. It might have a connection, but it means simply the oracles, the mediums, like the Oracle of Delphi, for example, is a Sibyl, and he was a necromancer, transmitter of information from beyond, usually demons, other things, gods. And so in Rome, since the end of the age of the kings and since the very beginning of the Republic, Rome was its most important decisions were shaped by this committee of augurs who would be the only ones allowed to interpret the transcriptions from the three Sibylline books that were purchased by Tarquin around 500 or so BC. And so basically, these were the utterings of the Oracle of Delphi that were like transcribed, read and very symbolic, from what accounts remain, because the books were destroyed several times over. But it's basically like very, very vague ramblings, very much open to interpretation, which is why they always need a high priesthood to interpret what the mutterings are for the general or whoever's paying the money to know, like, do I go to war or whatever. That's the power of it. Geopolitically, and that's what the augurs were doing in the committee for Rome and the Senate. And they basically said, well, it's kind of like the I Ching or runes, but you throw the little stones down, see what the rune symbols come up, and then the druids can tell the king what they could do. So they said, okay, if you want to beat Hannibal, you got to bring in this mystery cult from Anatolia as well, or from Phrygia, and that'll be Cybele-Attis. It was brought in, and it was men were allowed to join, though it was principally a feminine priestess-oriented cult. So whereas the male...
If I may interject, that's one of the things that I find interesting, because on one side you have a more male-oriented cult, which is Mithraism, and then on the other hand you have this more feminine cult, which is Cybele, and then its priests self-castrated in these elevated states, that's a tough gig to have.
Yeah, no, it was weird. And that's why they didn't do well. So after a few decades, the Roman families got pissed that their young men were castrating themselves to become hierophants. Hierophants being the priests who would oversee the proceedings. So you had to go into an altered state, usually some forms of drugs, because they were all practicing the Eleusinian Mysteries. Eleusinian Mysteries are just a practice in Eleusis, a place where, you'd basically be put through a ritual that involved some form of psychedelic concoction that would help, just like the MK Ultra thing in more modern times, to help, depattern, mixed in with a few incense, a few controlled experiences catered for you, who feel like you've died, a terrible death, or an ayahuasca experience over 3 days of hell, and then you come back out of it and you're like a new person. But not really. There's always a catch. So they were it sort of was not exclusive to any one cult. All the cults were engaged in practicing that. That was part of the pilgrimage experience, and then whether you're in Isis or Cybele-Attis. And so part of the thing, they were all utilizing psychedelic drugs, it seems, and it could have been varieties of opiates or LSD, or fungus from wheat, which it seems like that's the most likely of them, but might be a little bit of a mixture of a few things. All that to say, with these altered states, they would cut off their schlongs, and then they were run out. The families, the moms, the dads, because Rome still valued families and traditional values. They ran the cult out of town, and it had to go underground for a few centuries. And it was only when Rome started getting a lot more decadent and imperial that the cult was able to come back to the surface. And it was even receiving support by Caligula and Nero, as was the cult of Mithra, as I get at in my book.
You talking about Nero? He was initiated into the Mithraistic, I guess would be the term, knowledge.
Yeah, he sanctioned, gave it a lot of support. Yeah.
I'm just going to riff kind of extemporaneously for a second. There were several things when I was reading your book, and I was thinking about this particular moment in time right now. There's all the memes about the Los Angeles fires in which Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass are seen playing, the violin, much like Nero. And you and I are now having this discussion about mystery cults. Also, the use of psychedelics is on the crease. And I'm not going to lie, I've used psychedelics. I've used ayahuasca, and But at the same time, and we will get to Assalin, I understand your point. So on the Attis priests, and this is just free association, I could be dead wrong. But when I read this, it also makes me think of the current trans movement, this getting away from a particular sexual identity and moving into a more androgynous. I don't know. These are thoughts that I have had while I have been reading your book.
No, those are thoughts that popped in my head too while I was studying this stuff. It's very visceral. The aspect of the evaluating or the placing of such high value of almost the sacred onto the creation of the fusing together of opposites, whether the sacred, the profane, the male, the feminine, into unity. So there are natural, healthy ways, I think, to overcome contradictory opposites. There's a healthy way of resolving opposites, and that's not what they're doing, though. I wouldn't say that there isn't such a thing as a male energy and a female energy. There's obviously, something very, very different in nature, but at the higher state, we can all make discoveries. We can all love God. We can all find joy in fighting evil and doing the good and sharing for the future. So all human beings are human beings fundamentally. And then there's like this quality where women have certain attributes and there's a male thing. And there's a balance. You don't want to be too tyrannical and stiff upper lip to be like to embody just the masculine, as they say, logical tendencies, which is where a lot of the leftists attack Western civilization, because they're like, white males. It's the white male energy. Yeah, the patriarchy, justified empire, and enslaving the weak and women and other. And there's an element of truth. Mm-hmm. There's but then they'll say, but that's why we need the female matriarchal spirit to be revived as an opposite extreme. Well, it's not like matriarchies there's not evidence of like tons of war and oppression in matriarchal systems and human sacrifice. It's like you got that too. It's not like that's all that better. So like men should find those qualities of intuition and cultivate the emotions that should be done, while at the same time the mind is cultivated. And women should also cultivate the mind and as well as their emotions, and we should all like find the proper harmony and balance so that we're the best of who we can be and who we were meant to be. Now the oligarchy, they're very much based upon ritualizing the female and the male energy in a very sexualized eros manner in their customs. That is why I think that when you look at the practices of Mithra, you often had like family rituals every Sunday, like people go to Sunday church. That back then, you'd have the family go out, and the men would go into their Mithraic rituals for the most part. The wives and daughters would go upstairs to the Cybele-Attis temple, and then they would meet back and have supper together or whatever. And there would be there were so many members, and just like any initiatory secret society, most people have no clue what the esoteric inner doctrine is. They're still at the lower exoteric front message, which sounds all probably very nice and fine and late in life. But these things were seeded specifically to create a blueprint to guide the growth of nefarious political processes that I could see that justified the growth of an imperial structure of control over a master-slave system in society. And that's the biggest nefarious thing that I could see in the whole Cybele-Attis. And the thing I didn't mention too, Attis, the reason why these male hierophants did that, the male priests, they had to cut their schlongs off, was because, as the story goes, Attis, who's this emasculated deity in the story, this creation story of Cybele, he's like her human husband, brother thing,
son, something.
Yeah, combo.
Yeah.
And he falls in love with a mortal. She gets pissed and jealous, and so he's so petrified of her. He's like almost like a Kali figure, like her. She's a creature of terror who represents just fertility. She is Demeter, the harvest goddess, but she's also terror. And he's so terrified, he basically runs out of the forest and goes crazy and cuts off his schlong in order to say, "I'm so sorry, darling." And he bleeds out and dies, and then she revives him. So he dies and he's revived. And that's part of the process that they want to replicate then in their rituals to create the priests. And just a few years later, that was 204, and the guy Fabius Maximus, who was the general from Rome who was fighting Hannibal and innovated this technique of war by attrition and avoiding direct conflict, but also infiltration that the Fabian Society later on used as their model. That guy Fabius, who was the guy who he was a high-level Christian oligarch of Rome, who brokered bringing in this cult. A few years later, after 204, I think it was 199 BC, that's when the Isis Serapis cult was brought officially into Rome too. So both of these feminine-oriented cults were both brought in around the exact same time to fulfill a similar kind of a cultural effect, I believe, in the takeover of Rome and the transformation of Rome from a republic into something more useful as an instrument of this high priesthood from Persia then in Babylon.
And they both, it seems to me, are related to Gaia, this idea of Gaia, which to me, is that correct?
Right. All three. But that's where the Mithras are, the Mithraic, even though it's male only, is worshiping in Gaia's womb, in the Earth Mother womb, even though it's male only. The other ones, Gaia is effectively, Cybele is an Earth Mother goddess, and so is Isis. Oh, Isis is maybe a bit more of a navigational harvest goddess, but still, yeah.
When I think of all this, at least to me, this Gaia kind of worship and end-time cult of its own would be the climate agenda. You condemn Christian Zionism and end times ideas, which I get. And then I thought at the same time, but isn't climate change its own type of end-timed cult? And if it is, does that not tie back to these kind of Gaia worship type ideas?
Good thought, man. Yeah, I think you have a good point. I would presume that in the crafting of the green movement, which directly came out of the Fabian Society operation of the late 19th century, they were consciously trying to revive a new ethos surrounding a society ruled by the feminine principle, the old high priestess principle, and part of the technique of the Fabian Society set up by these misanthropic eugenicists like Beatrice Webb, Annie Besant, who leads the Theosophists, is also a leading Fabian. H.G. Wells, what they're utilizing, or George Bernard Shaw. Yep. There's many other, Bertrand Russell for a period.
I didn't know any of this until only a few years ago, and I'm embarrassed to have to say that. But
me too. It kind of just, but when it hits you, you can't unsee this, right?
Exactly.
But the method that they're utilizing is this Jesuitical Templar feminine practice of subvert by absorbing. So like use the topography. They're more inclined to act upon the cultural, emotional dynamics that shape mass behavior in groups that you want to target in order to have the masses become instruments that will absorb. Let's say you have a grouping that you want to overthrow, like a nation you want to overthrow. Well, you might want to cultivate. This is why they sold themselves as being socialistic, the Fabian socialists, because that's what they found to be useful. And so people will be organized around feelings of injustice, feelings of vengeance against an elite class of rich people, and they will then be used to just overthrow and destroy by absorption. So it's kind of, again, the idea of the feminine principle. You infiltrate, you permeate, you absorb, think multi-generationally, have patience. The Jesuits, I think, were also operating on this principle when they were seated around the same time that the Knights of Malta were created, around the same year in 1534. And the Knights of Malta just being a carryover from the Knights Hospitaller, right, from the Crusader Knights, that would work as a parallel order to the Templars. So the Templars had a little bit more of that Mithraic quality in some ways as like Crusader forces, but they also had a feminine quality as well. The Knights of Malta had a bit more of a masculine quality. They're the ones who were overseeing the Inquisition. They're the ones that were a little bit more based on what the Round Table movement was doing of Cecil Rhodes, of like having, if you look at the Milner Kindergarten, the Rhodesian logic that oversaw the Boer War and other wars that even groomed the Knights of Malta members that became the head of the SS or the heads of the SS or later the heads of the CIA. It's much more based on this penetrate from above, this masculine penetrate power of impose will onto the masses. You don't feel just impose the will onto the thelemic doctrine, right? Whereas the feminine principle is more weaponize feelings, weaponize mass behavior, absorb. And you have this like penetrate, absorb technique either between the Knights of Malta and the Jesuits that also kind of play together over the years, infiltrating but working together at the higher levels. And so too with the Fabians and Round Table. Often they seem to be opponents or rivals, but they actually work together at the higher levels, which is why the Canadian Fabian Society, which is where I live, was founded by 5 Rhodes Scholars who are part of the Round Table. So you got these, that's sort of the way it kind of plays off with each other. And I think that was the case in ancient times too. No different.
You talk about these cults having great disdain for Christianity, and they want to wipe out Christianity, but they can't do that. So they then infiltrate, as you just mentioned. Tell us some of the ways that they did that.
Well, it seems like
you talk about the Gnostic kind of gospels and things like that, and then certain occult type ideas that were infused into versions of Christianity.
Yeah, the Gnostics were the first iteration, I think, of an attempt to infiltrate Christianity. If you couldn't destroy it so physically from the outside, you know, as many people as were thrown into the pit of lions or like lit as Roman torches to be burned alive, as a message to other Christians to say, just repent and come back to the pagan fold. It wasn't working for the first, 100 years or so after Christ, Jesus was dead and his apostles were systematically murdered. But the movement, as a movement, especially led by the additional sort of insights of St. Paul, it kind of kept on spreading. No matter how many Christians were killed and tortured, it was still spreading. So it seems like early on in the mid-1st century or so, followers of Simon the Magician, like a guy named Valentinius, Marcius, Alcides a little bit later on, was a follower of Valentinius. Mani had a different variation of it. The Manichaeans had a sort of Gnostic Zoroastrian version where they infused different elements, but they incorporated some of the surface appearances of Christianity to call themselves Christian in order to subvert it from within, since you couldn't just destroy it from the outside. And since Christianity before Nicaea was so unregulated, like there was no real agreed upon oversight or what is this thing called Christianity? What are the canonized texts? It was so open, which had a good quality about that. It did create a space for more creativity, more feeling, like less confined structure, which is certainly good for creativity. But at the same time, in the real politic of the world that this early movement was growing in, faced with these very centralized, well-organized mystery cults, it wasn't working for Christianity. And so it was so open for infiltration, and so many subgroups and subcults calling themselves Christian, but practicing things like the eating of the host, the actual cannibalism. They were actually the drinking of the blood, the eating of the flesh. They took that very literally. And for many good Romans who were Stoics or others, they were kind of horrified when they would see that, oh, that's what the Christians are? They're the cannibals? Like, stay away from the Christians. So it was really creating a situation where it was amplifying a hedonistic outlook, an outlook that detached the initiates from any type of participation within the customs of the society. There's a tendency to, the Gnostics they had their own cosmology that seemed to emphasize the fact that the world is created ultimately evil, and that we have to sort of learn to break free of the evil that is creation, because the creation is made by Yaldabaoth, as was documented in, I think it's the Apocalypse of John or something. There's a few of the Nag Hammadi texts that go through the Yaldabaoth story, and that basically, as the punchline goes, the god you thought you were worshiping from the stories of the Old Testament is actually the evil demiurge and not God. That's just who made the image and the world in 7 days in his own ignorant, evil image. And we have to shed the customs of this world in order to go back to the pure light that is above and beyond good and evil, which is all about what all of these guys are always trying to do. They're always trying to, whether it's B.F. Skinner, Crowley, or Jung, or they're always like trying to fetishize, or Nietzsche, creating a system that will get people to become convinced that judging right and wrong is ignorant. You should only the stupid people try to judge right and wrong. The true wise man or woman goes beyond right and wrong to just simply different states of the same thing.
Beyond good and evil.
Yeah, beyond good and evil. Yeah. So that's sort of what they were, I think, one of the promised outcomes. And the Gnostics ultimately, there was a giant war for a good century between, I think, the more authentic tonic Christians who were really doing, like, were engaged in battle with the higher mystery cults. People like Origen of Alexandria, Saint Irenaeus of Lyons, like the writings of a lot of these early church fathers who were at war with these things. Saint Irenaeus of Lyons is just mind-blowingly good. He writes in Platonic dialogues. He's so multi-level profound and understands the nature of the epistemological battle that finally, these groupings were able to make certain wins in battle against the Gnostics, who were basically shut down. They had to go more underground. Council of Nicaea, at the very least, did some good by creating some agreed upon framework of the Nicene Creed of, like, what is this thing called Christianity that will have certain non-negotiable characteristics as far as, like, how do we see Jesus, what is God, what is the soul, like certain things that were non-negotiable, which were necessary, I believe, to just create a power structure that could do battle with the empire. That doesn't mean that the empire didn't infiltrate as well, because there was thousands of people who participated in the Council of Nicaea in 325, thousands, and disputes and battles and compromises were made. In some cases, there were Constantine, who oversaw or who sanctioned it, was, in my assessment, still practicing occultist. I don't think he was ever actually. I think he was a follower of the cult of Apollo, if anything. I don't think he was ever actually a Christian, but he saw the political usefulness of having some control over an increasingly chaotic situation in his realm. But there were overall, I think, good things in that sense of the authentic Christians winning the day in that one. And the mystery cults didn't disappear even after Stilicho burnt down the remaining Sibylline books and shut down the Neoplatonic. Because a lot of these things seem to be. Okay, so here's the thing too. I like Plato a lot. I'm a big Platonist. However, I've come to realize that after Plato died, his academy of the Academy of Athens became infiltrated by his enemies, who masqueraded as Platonic, but they were actually bringing in the thinking of Hermes Trismegistus, the Kabbalah, the Simon the Magi. So they started seeding and controlling mystery cults. That was the control center, one of the main control centers by around 80 BC for these things was the School of Athens, which finally got shut down in around by, I think it was Stilicho, maybe a little bit later, 520 maybe. So it seems like there were several orders, but the first one that seems to have been like the one that had the greatest enduring value for the bad, but like that's still very present in our age, was the creation of the Benedictines, the followers of Benedict, who appears to have been a retooled. Well, he was a leading patrician who had a mystical experience in a cave in around 520 with his twin sister Scholastica. It seems like there was the cult of Apollo, which is another solar I mean, it's a carryover from the cult of Mithra. Apollo, Helios, Mithra, they're very much overlapping. Established this order which seeded and grew in, I think, an exoteric and esoteric fashion, a new type of Christianity after the 6th century and onward that appears to have seeded the Templars, the Hospitallers, and has been there to this very day, even overseeing the growth of the New Templar revival, which was a Benedictine revival in Germany of Cistercian monks that created a movement of Volkishism that was the heart and soul of what became the Nazi high command later on, and that never was resolved or dealt with. So yeah, that's a lot. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. One thing I want to jump to is the Assalin Institute, because you do have a chapter on that, because I want to jump to the present, because some people might say, all right, okay, well, we can accept that these mystery cults existed and they had influence. They were perhaps a hidden hand. But what would a mystery cult look like today? Would something like the World Economic Forum be a mystery cult? Would something like Assalin be a mystery cult? Talk about Assalin for a second.
I think Esalen is a home.
Esalen.
Yeah, however people pronounce it. I don't actually, I say Esalen, but it might be spelled pronounced differently.
You're probably right.
But I think that they're more like institutional place, like things, places that are home to mystery cult activity, and that were seeded by mystery cult practices and initiates, of which I believe Michael Murphy and Richard Price, who were the two official founders of Esalen, were both initiated in various ways in mystery cults. In the case of Murphy, it was through the Aurobindo Pali Lodge in India. So it was an ashram where there was one of the followers of the cosmic movement, whose name I'm forgetting, his weird name, but there was oh man, I'm blanking. But
No worries.
anyway, yeah, Mira Alfaze was the mother. She played the role of sort of the Kali actualized mother, the sexualized deity of creative destruction. And so she was like a handler of Sri Aurobindo Goza, who is a Mazziniite anarchist bomb thrower, trained in England, worked for the Indian Civil Service under the British Empire, and then he became a leading anarchist, handled by Sister Nivedita. Sister Nivedita was an associate of Annie Besant's, a theosophical figure who was brought in to handle Vivekananda, the Swami who was sort of assigned the role of westernizing a certain variation of Hinduism for a Western audience. He was brought into Chicago at the big Parliament of Religions in the 1890s, 1893. And he was like, so he had a good talent for speaking. He seemed to have had handlers throughout his adult life. He himself was a follower of the Kali priesthoods of India. I forgot the name of his teacher all of a sudden, but so he was a a Kali initiate. And so for a period before he died, and then in 1902, but he met Sister Nivedita, who's an Irish socialist reformer who became a Kali priestess. She wrote a whole book on Kali the Mother. And so she handled him for a few years. Then she went on to sort of manage the anarchist cells of terrorists that were seeded by British intelligence. Mm-hmm. And she was the handler of a big nexus of these things, which Aurobindo was also on the steering committee. And after she died, Aurobindo had a new handler assigned to him in the form of Mira Alfaze, another Kali priestess. She was Max von Theon. That's him. The weird name I was telling you. So Max von Theon is the founder of the cosmic movement. And one of his disciples is this Algerian French aristocratic woman, Mira Alfaze, who trained under him in North Africa. And so she was assigned to then be the handler of Aurobindo. They created a lodge where it was admired by Aldous Huxley, social engineers from all over. Carl Jung admired it. They took the type of Hindu Kali practices that had been groomed by the Theosophists earlier under Blavatsky and then Besant in India. So they were basically trying to retool Hinduism to become something that would be more useful for their political controls in the creation of a one world religion. And so people began traveling all over the world, of which Michael Murphy was one of them, to train under this Kali priestess. And he came back a new man and was inspired, following the instructions of Aldous Huxley, to create this Assalin Institute in '61 in Big Sur, California. And it seems to have been, in my assessment, sort of a Mithraic stronghold in America that was designed to oversee the cultural transformation of the young guinea pigs that were born after World War II in the form of baby boomers, who were targeted to go under a sort of group mass hypnotic induction and initiation in the form of what became the sex, drugs, rock and roll counterculture that Esalen oversaw. They were not just doing the cultural work. They weren't just doing that. They were also at the same time working with Stanford, the military industrial complex, creating the Stanford Research Institute that was also bringing in things like the Stargate project that utilized a lot of process church Satanists, Scientologists of a very high level, that then set the stage for the reorganization of the American military top brass in what seemed like a fringe thing in the 70s. A movie was made on this called The Men Who Stare at Goats.
Yes.
That ended up becoming the thing that retooled the entire U.S. military itself to be a much more Jedi creating a bunch of useful idiot mystics who thought they could run through walls and had mind powers of clairvoyance and astral projection,
Remote
It
viewing.
gave them remote viewing that gave him a sense of like, I'm an elite, superhuman. It fed that Harry Potter Marvel comic desire we all have to, that secret identity of being the more than human mutant that is above regular humans. So it kind of groomed that thing psychologically that the oligarchy loves in their victims.
Several years ago, I guess probably 2016, 2017, I was doing a show for a company called Lip TV. It was called Antidote. And I'm spacing on Sean's last name. Sean had a show called Buzzsaw. And
Sean Stone.
yes, I can't believe I just had the senior moment. But anyway, Sean had a show, and I was told to do less of the type of content I was doing because Sean was already doing a lot of it, which was cool. He was there before me. Anyway, at one point he has Michael Aquino on the show. And after that, people were like, Parker, you should have Aquino on the show. And I'm like, yo, I have zero interest in talking to Michael Aquino about anything. And I'm not trying to judge, Sean. I'll be honest, I didn't even watch the episode because I'm so incredibly creeped out by the guy that no, I couldn't believe that people were saying to me, you should have him on the show. I'm like, I think that I know plenty about Michael Aquino and we're not going to cross paths.
Yeah, Aquino and Valalay both rebranded themselves pretty effectively in the last 15, 16 years to become like heroes of the like right conservative, even MAGA groups tend to like both Aquino and Paul Valalay. These are Valalay being the co-author, right, with Aquino of the Mind Wars paper that was the blueprint for the revolution in military affairs. And I mean, yeah, like Aquino was part of like some very insidious child sex trafficking operations that he was a part of with his weird wife.
That is how I first heard of the man.
Yeah, I know. I mean, me too. And then you dig into him a little bit more, and you're like, oh, he's got above top secret clearance.
Yeah.
And this guy was like one of the key leads under Edward Lansdale. That seems where he got his stripes after becoming inducted by Anton LaVey's Church of Satan. And probably participating in the Zodiac murders, from what I can see in '68. Seems like he participated in that. He went on to become, under Lansdale, one of the top controllers of Operation Phoenix in Vietnam. And they love these types of things like the Boer War, the Vietnam War, because it creates a very unnatural, hard to create situation for initiates to go and just, do Marlon Brando apocalypse now.
Inhumane acts.
Yeah, exactly. Highly valuable for the conditioning process. So these wars serve multiple levels of purpose, and that's one of them is create Satanists who are going to be higher up, responsible for the creative warfare aspect of things. So that's what Aquino seems to have come out was with a lot of techniques that he mastered of the dark arts of psychological operations, outright mass murder of civilians. 40,000 civilians, non-combatants were murdered under Operation Phoenix. God knows, might have been even more, frankly. They weren't keeping great records, and so he came out of that, and then in 75 creates his Temple of Set after he goes to Wewelsburg Castle. And he has this insight or this flash on a hallucinogenic trip that he's talking to a demon who's explaining to him that he's the reincarnation of Aleister Crowley. And so he has his own, as Crowley had his 1904 experience being given the book of the law, the Lima.
Yeah.
It in Egypt, or somewhere else north of that. No, it was Egypt. That's what Aquino had in 75, and he was told, whereas Crowley was setting up the 1,000-year Reich, the age of Horus, you're going to be setting up the Reich of Set, which is sort of just a revamping of the Setian Gospels. So the idea that Jesus is actually Satan.
Right.
It is the spirit of Lucifer is the secret Jesus. The true Jesus is the secret esoteric Jesus that had promoted, like Simon the Magi promoted, sacred prostitutes like Mary Magdalene and had babies that became the Merovingians and all that stuff. So they create a whole sacred story for them. And so Aquino's doing all of this while he's interfacing with these Esalen folks and process church church Satanists, who themselves seem to be an outgrowth of the Scientologists, which itself is an outgrowth of Aleister Crowley and the
Yes.
OTO that
Yeah.
Hubbard was a part of. And then he's, being assigned all of these high-level things to oversee the revolution in military affairs, and he's taking credit for Desert Storm later on, how the people processed through his program following the Mind Wars document
And the
became the
shock
top
and awe.
generals. Shock and awe, 9/11, like it. The reason why America, you're like, did America go crazy? You're like, what caused those crazy ass unhuman decisions to be made? And it's like, yeah, kind of by design. But then he's rebranted to become like a pro MAGA, pro QAnon persona in his interviews during Trump's first administration. Aquino and Paul Valalay are both retooled as promoting QAnon, promoting the white hats, and all of a sudden you could justify why all of this, the evil stuff they had to do, because there's this higher fight against the great black lodge of super evil alien demons that requires that we do sometimes distasteful things and fight for in a battle of something you can't possibly understand, mere mortal.
Right. I did not know that he was involved with QAnon. I was not a QAnon guy, and I knew people who were. And what I thought of QAnon from the get-go is like, wow, guys, this is a way to get you to do nothing. This is a way for you to be you're being controlled because you think that somebody else is going to do something for you. I mean, or this cause that you support. No, man, it basically was a sedation technology in some ways.
Yeah, I got the same feeling too. It's like, and I get along with some QAnon people. I have a show on a very QAnon platform, and my co-host is very much into it, and we get along because I also believe in conspiracies for the good as well as for the bad, and so we can speak a common language. But yeah, in my view, it's a total like political intelligence operation designed to get that effect that you just described, and as well as I think to make people more just you lose powers of what citizens could and should become if you're taking personal responsibility for things, than if you're waiting for eating the popcorn and ultimately waiting for the white hats to sweep in, who have it all under control. And Biden's been under control of the white hats, and it's all good, and maybe there's like different narratives you could add on to that on top of the cake, but
that has been a very incredibly frustrating experience for me to watch. And like yourself, I can get along with people of many walks of life, or some idea might sound completely crazy to most people, but I can listen to it and I can appreciate it. I don't have to necessarily agree with it or believe it, but I can understand it, and I can understand how another person or a group of people get that. But for me, the QAnon thing was particularly insidious and dangerous because people that wanted something so bad were led to believe that something was happening when it was never happening, and I believe it was clearly an intelligence operation for that purpose.
Yeah, well, I tend to think that it kind of grew out of the first anonymous operation, which always kind of gave me the creeps because you're using a major Hollywood film, which itself has weird social underpinnings to it, like V for Vendetta, and the
good point.
Yeah, right there. And the Wachowski brothers also seem to have been sort of victims of some weird operation to go transgender.
Big time. I think I think both of them went changed their gender.
Yeah, they're both sisters now, and it seems like the whole Matrix franchise seemed to have been part of the broader. That's how I'm thinking about it now. At first, I find that they're entertaining, very well done movies, but they're very sophisticated.
Big time.
And when I listen to the Wachowski sisters speak about their motives and what they were thinking and what they wanted to do when they made those movies to explain the philosophy, they can't do it. Which means the fact that they're so incompetent at putting into words what the movie's about, why they did it, indicates to me that they're just cardboard cutouts, and that there's a much more sophisticated operation behind the construction of that film to get certain effects, which do parallel in many ways Plato's allegory of the cave for a transhumanist audience, which does create certain subliminal constructs within the broader zeitgeist of people who might seem normie, but had this baked into their now framework of thinking about what is reality as being maybe you're all just floating brains in a jar in the future, which is now being taught in official university courses. This is now becoming more mainstream. Even Elon Musk is coming out saying there's a 1 in 50 billion chance that we're not living in a computer simulation. So I think the idea was always to sort of do the sleight of hand, right? Whereby the idea would be to convince people that you're living in a dream, that the ability to differentiate dream from waking is going to be removed from your powers of judgment. And when you look at things like Game B that emerged, 14 years ago, it began in its first iteration. It's very much, that's what Brett Weinstein is as a co-creator of this Game B thing. It's all these Silicon Valley transhumanist types who are like playing a video game called Humankind. And they're being, to a certain degree, Eric Weinstein's a part of this. The Peter Thiel operation is heavily baked into this Game B thing of groupings around Stuart Brand, who was like one of the key handlers of the Grateful Dead back in the early 60s,
Yes.
like a guy who was overseeing a big chunk of the Esalen operation, or what the Esalen operation was involved with. This guy was doing early cyberneticist, still alive. But you got these creepy characters playing their human Dungeons and Dragons Sims game or whatever, and they've got their own sort of baked in like view of what they think human beings are as a digital creature living in a
either the similarity or the multiverse. Those are the big thoughts that have been kind of shoved down our throats over the last 20 years, that we're either living in a simulation or we're living in this multiverse.
Yeah.
Listen, I can't tell you that we're not living in either, but I don't know that it makes any difference at the end of the day, because this is the reality that we exist in, and this is the only one we have to work with, at least on our level.
Yeah, I think so. It's like, I take that same view. It's like maybe there are, but I mean, so many people want to skip steps and start, living in this other universe that you don't even know exists, or these other universes that you don't exist, and shape your identity around the supposition of their characteristics without first having taken the least bit of time to properly develop your own mental tools in a sober way to understand the nature of this world that you definitely know you're in. So they're just skipping steps,
That made me laugh, man. It's the one that that you're in. Absolutely, ladies and gentlemen, we're gonna stop it there. I'm gonna have Matt back. We're in a month. We're gonna talk about Volume 2, because this is a trilogy, and then a month after that, we're gonna do the third book, because we still got to cover transhumanism. We've got to talk about Elon Musk. We've got to talk about Edgar Allan Poe. We've got to talk about a lot of things. There's a lot of material here. Matt, tell everybody how they find you and your work.
Yeah, thanks, by the way, for doing this. This is fun. It's first time I've actually taken an interview for each of the 3 of these volumes. Nobody ever proposed that to me before, so this is
it's
cool.
Fascinating, and it's too big to do in one interview. I'm not the guy that wants to do a 3-hour interview like a lot of people do, and I appreciate that, but that's not my style, so we got to break it up.
Yeah, no, that's cool, man. I really, really, really appreciate that a lot. Yeah, I guess for people who want to check out the books, they can pick them all up on CanadianPatriot.org. They're available on Amazon, PDFs. I got a few hard copies, which my wife is the co-author of the first one with me, and so we can sign those and send them if people are interested. Otherwise, my Substack is always there, free and paid upgrade options both. That's MatthewEhret.substack.com, and last but not least, RisingTideFoundation.net. It's my wife and I. We have this nonprofit, and we put forth a lot of educational, cultural material on there, weekly meetings. So that's always available for people to check out too.
One idea I want to leave the audience with before we get out of here, and it's something that you and I agree on. Do you believe in the goodness of humans? You believe that we are born good? Talk about that for just a minute, and then we'll get out of here.
Babies are good. I don't believe in natural born killers. I don't think that that's true.
I agree with you, brother. And that's the way I'm going to choose to continue to live. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. If you like the show, if you appreciate what we're doing here, please give us a thumbs up, give us a like, give us a subscription. All of it helps me immensely. I mentioned the James Fox interview earlier on. We're going to get him back on. We're going to get that rescheduled, and we're going to have Matt back here in a month to move on to book 2. My name is Michael Parker. This is Michael Parker Media. And until next time, keep your heart and your mind open. Peace.